It's Friday, the 25th of July, and you're watching Europe Today, where we'll be bringing you reactions to the EU-China summit in Beijing. There was a joint statement on climate cooperation, but little more. And on the most contentious issue of trade and economics, the differences between both sides were laid bare.
So we have reached a clear inflection point. As we said to the Chinese leadership, for trade to remain mutual, beneficial, it must become more balanced.
President Xi Jinping, meanwhile, claimed the EU's problems don't come from China and that the European bloc should properly handle differences and frictions. Let's cross over to our journalist Horge Libero, who is following the Beijing talks for us from Brussels. Jorge, welcome to the show. First, is it fair to say that on the issue of trade, EU leaders von der Leyen and Costa left Beijing with very little results?
Yes, Marit, indeed. There were little results, but at least there was one commitment, which is new, to establish an upgraded mechanism to monitor the supply chain of critical raw materials. This, of course, comes after Beijing restricted the exports of these materials that we need for the defense and technological sectors. And Brussels was very mad about it. We remember Ursula von der Leyen denouncing the restrictions as blackmail. So we can consider this mechanism as a sort of breakthrough, even though it's still unclear how much it will improve the situation for European companies.
And also, Jorge, President von der Leyen did say that more progress on trade was both needed and possible. Do you think it's realistic, or is it just wishful thinking from her side?
Well, Marit, I think, honestly speaking, that's more on the wishful thinking side, because we know that China has so far refused to make any substantial or tangible concessions when it comes to trade. The main problem right now is overcapacity, and we know how the story goes. The subsidies that China injects in domestic companies to boost production. But China doesn't have the internal capacity to absorb this production, so these products go to international markets, including the European market. Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa called and demanded for immediate change to this overcapacity. The relation, they say, is unsustainable. But so far, we don't see any willingness from the Chinese leadership to really curtail this capacity, so the issue is expected to remain high on the agenda.
Jorge, thank you so much for that update. Now, Brussels and Beijing are in talks to set minimum prices on Chinese-made electric vehicles instead of the tariffs imposed by the EU last year. There was hope this summit could help find a breakthrough, but the deadlock remains. Earlier, I spoke to Lar Shupert, the CEO of Zeekr Europe, which is the EV arm of Geely Holdings, one of the Chinese companies impacted by EU tariffs. Mr. Shupert, welcome to the show. Give us a sense first of Zeekr's expansion plans in Europe. Where are those plans at, and how are they being impacted by the EU's tariffs on China-made electric vehicles?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. First of all, we have been launching Zeekr as a brand in Europe now for a little bit more than 2 years, and have been launching first in the Nordic markets, where we have a high EV adoption rate in Norway, Sweden, Denmark. And now we're continuing the growth in further countries like Belgium, Switzerland, and several others.
Are the tariffs introduced by the European Union an obstacle to those expansion plans? Will you, for example, have to consider moving more production to Europe?
So our commitment is clearly here, but the tariffs are hindering us moving in that speed forward since last year. However, we have done our homework, and we are now very much convinced that our sustainable go-to-market approach is now prepared after they have been announced. So our commitment is to expand further. Our commitment is to deliver high-level premium products to our consumers in Europe.
Finally, Mr. Shupert, you mentioned that you want free trade, but then the EU is saying, well, this trading relationship is unbalanced because China is pumping subsidies into companies like yours, something the Chinese do not openly acknowledge. Do you accept that the EU has big concerns about an unbalanced level playing field here?
I am following the discussion very closely. But I think our big homework is to gain the trust of the consumers. And that is where our main work is on now, launching the markets, creating a brand experience, and having a clear relationship to the consumers in Europe, convincing with the products, and also attractive pricing and price value proposition where we can be successful. And the last months, looking into our sales in the markets where we are live, is proving that we are really on the right track.
That was the CEO of Sika Europe speaking to Europe Today. Now, as well as the unbalanced trade relationship, EU leaders voiced other concerns to their Chinese counterparts, including human rights and China's no-limits partnership with Russia. Alessio Dell'Anna has more.
Is China the EU's toughest balancing act? Brussels is stuck between human rights and economic priorities when dealing with its top import partner. Ties have rarely been this strained. It began in 2021 with the EU sanctioning Chinese officials and entities over reports of mass detentions and forced labor of the Uyghur ethnic minority. China retaliated, but relations soured more a year later when Beijing refused to condemn Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Instead, China massively increased trade with Moscow, offsetting the impact of EU sanctions. Trade between Russia and China more than doubled between 2022 and 2024, fueled by Chinese purchases of Russian energy, notably coal and oil, while Beijing increased EV sales to Russia by almost 600%. Brussels' response was to target Chinese banks with sanctions, but according to the EU, the Russia-China bond is increasingly nuanced. Reports say Chinese state-controlled media and social media channels are providing a platform to Russia and amplifying pro-Kremlin narratives. Add to that concerns for China's security crackdown in Hong Kong and territorial claims on Taiwan. With so many faulty lines, can EU-China relations still find a way forward?
That was Alessio Dell'Anna reporting there. Now, I'm joined by two members of the European Parliament, Cynthia Ni Murchu from the Renew Europe group and Lucas Mandl of the EPP. Welcome to you both to the show. Do you feel there was a lost opportunity here as well for the EU to take a harsher line on China in terms of concerns around human rights violations in Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong, for example?
I think these issues have been raised, and I think generally it is good that the summit could have taken place. Actually, it leaves us with more questions than answers so far, but it's good that we at least know the questions now, because my approach is that we should not only talk about China, which has been done over many years on the European level. We have to talk with China as well.
But Cynthia, Lucas mentions talk, but is the problem here too much talk and too little action?
I believe you could be right. I'm more on your side in the sense of the question being posed, because I think China is dismantling the free press. I think we're seeing continuous bully boy tactics, if I could call it that, against anyone who stands up against or even questions the Chinese leadership. And we also have seen a suppression of freedom of ideas and freedom of expression in Hong Kong and other places, and of course threats to Taiwan. So I think the human rights issue is a really, really important issue, needs to be kept front and centre.
And some of your colleagues from the Parliament's China delegation were in Taiwan this week to learn about cybersecurity operations, disinformation campaigns. We don't hear a lot about that from China. Lucas, how much of a concern is this for you?
The strategic compass calls China also a partner in economic terms and also a competitor in economic terms. And this is what we have to see and to address as well. We see worldwide so-called disinformation campaigns, foreign interference, and we have to clearly observe what we also are doing in the European Union Democracy Shield Special Committee in the European Parliament. We have to clearly observe where these threats come from, and if applications like TikTok would be used to interfere within Europe, what actually has happened in Romania, for example, during the presidential elections, then we have to address that directly.
Cynthia, do we need to be talking about restricting, regulating? We talk about regulating, but do we need to go further? Do we need to talk about a TikTok ban?
Oh, we certainly need to consider a TikTok ban. We certainly need to consider all restrictions and all bans, because we do know that China hasn't played by the rules when it came to international trade. We also do know that China supported Russia in their illegal war against Ukraine, and this was in direct contradiction of Europe's interests. And I'm sure that was raised and discussed very, very vociferously at the summit.
We talk about shielding Europe's democracy, yet we've seen China's, alleged direct interference in the European Parliament, the heart of Europe's democracy. We've heard allegations of Chinese spies in the Parliament, and most recently of influence peddling by Huawei targeting MEPs. Shouldn't this send alarm bells ringing?
This has to be addressed very directly with the Chinese counterparts. This is completely unacceptable. If you want to seek for cooperation, then it must be excluded that such kind of interference would take place in Europe.
Thank you both for joining us. That's all from us for today. Thank you for joining, and remember to stay up to date with all our coverage on Euronews and Euronews.com.